Good afternoon. Today we're going to create a comparative analysis on two cases, Taylor versus Rojas and Ulrich versus Pope County. We're going to explain the similarities and differences between the two cases, what drove the verdict to be different, what arguments were used, what do I think about these arguments. So now the similarities between Taylor versus Rojas and Ulrich versus Pope County include the fact that both cases involve the legal rights of inmates in correctional facilities. In both cases, the courts found that the inmates had the right to sue correctional facilities for violations of their constitutional rights. In both cases, the courts found that the inmate had a right to due process and to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the differences between the two cases include the type of violations in question. In Taylor versus Rojas, the court found that the prison violated the inmate's due process rights by failing to provide adequate notice and an opportunity to be heard before placing him in solitary confinement. In Ulrich versus Pope County, the court found that the jail violated the inmate's Eighth Amendment rights by failing to provide adequate medical care and by failing to take steps to prevent the inmate from suffering from serious health conditions due to his confinement. The arguments used in each case also differed. In Taylor versus Rojas, the court reasoned that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment had been violated because the inmate was not given adequate notice or an opportunity to be heard before being placed in solitary confinement. In Ulrich versus Pope County, the court reasoned that the Eighth Amendment had been violated because the jail had failed to provide adequate medical care and had failed to take steps to prevent the inmate from suffering from serious health conditions due to his confinement. I do believe the arguments used in both cases are valid. I think that the inmates should have had the right to due process and to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. And I think the courts were right to find that the prisons in both cases violated the inmates' constitutional rights. Now we're going to explain the similarities and differences between the Elijah McClain case, Taylor versus Rojas, and Ulrich versus Pope, and what drove the verdict in these cases, what arguments may support or not support qualified immunity, and what arguments were used. Now, the Elijah McClain case, Taylor versus Rojas, and Ulrich versus Pope County are similar in that all three cases involve the court determining the rights of individuals to receive adequate medical care. However, the verdicts of all three cases are vastly different. In Taylor versus Rojas, the court ruled in favor of the inmate, finding that the prison officials had been deliberately indifferent to his medical needs. The court found that the prison officials had failed to provide medical treatment to the inmate despite his repeated requests for medical attention. The court held that the prison officials had violated the inmate's Eighth Amendment rights and awarded him damages. In Ulrich versus Pope County, the court ruled in favor of the prison officials, finding that the inmate's medical needs were adequately addressed. The court found that the prison officials had not been deliberately indifferent to the inmate's medical needs, as they had provided medication, monitored the inmate's medical condition, and consulted with medical professionals. The court held that the prison officials had not violated the inmate's Eighth Amendment rights, and the inmate was not awarded damages. In the Elijah McClain case, the court is currently determining whether the officers are eligible for qualified immunity. In this case, qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that shields government officials from civil liability for actions taken while performing their official duties. The court is considering the facts of the case as well as the medical evidence to determine if the officers are eligible for this qualified immunity. In all three cases, the court has considered the facts of the case and the medical evidence in order to determine the rights of the individual. In Taylor versus Rojas and Ulrich versus Pope County, the court found that the medical evidence showed that the officials had either provided inadequate or adequate medical care. In the Elijah McClain case, the court is considering the medical evidence to determine if the officers are eligible for the stated qualified immunity. I think the arguments made in all three cases are valid. In Taylor versus Rojas, the court found that the prison officials had failed to provide medical care to the inmate despite his repeated requests for medical attention. In Ulrich versus Pope County, the court found that the prison officials had provided adequate medical care to the inmate and had consulted with medical professionals when necessary. In the Elijah McClain case, the court is considering the medical evidence to determine if the officers are eligible for qualified immunity. And I believe that the court is making the right decision in all three cases based on the facts and evidence presented. Now, in regards to the Elijah McClain case, did the officers meet their responsibility of due care for the arrestee's health in the incident? Did the emergency medical technicians, EMTs, and paramedics have the consent of the patient to provide care? And if not, did they violate the concept of due care? And in any situation such as this event, who has the crime scene responsibility for the safety and security of the arrestee? In the Elijah McClain case, the police officers were responsible for providing due care to the arrestee during the arrest. The officers had a duty to ensure the arrestee's health and safety and to provide medical assistance if needed. However, it is not clear if the officers met their responsibility of due care in the incident. The emergency medical technicians, EMTs, and paramedics were called to the scene of the arrest and provided medical care to the arrestee. However, it is not clear if the EMTs and paramedics had the consent of the arrestee to provide care, and if not, whether they violated the concept of due care. The police officers themselves have the crime scene responsibility for the safety and security of the arrestee. The officers must ensure that the arrestee is treated humanely and that their civil rights are not violated. The officers must also ensure that any medical assistance is provided in a timely manner. Three legal standards or precedents similar to the Elijah McClain case found in the required unit resources are Taylor versus Rojas, Ulrich versus Pope County, and Darnell versus City of New York. In Taylor versus Rojas, the court found that the prison officials had failed to provide adequate medical care to the inmate, despite his repeated requests for medical attention. This precedent could help the defendants in the Elijah McClain case, as it suggests that officials must provide medical care to individuals in custody. In Ulrich versus Pope County, the court found that the prison officials had provided adequate medical care to the inmate and had consulted with medical professionals when necessary. This precedent could hurt the defendants in the Elijah McClain case, as it suggests that officials can provide adequate medical care to individuals in custody. In Darnell versus City of New York, the court held that the police officers had a duty to ensure the arrestee's health and safety and to provide medical assistance if needed. This precedent could help the defendants in the Elijah McClain case, as it suggests the officers have a duty to provide medical care to individuals in custody. Also for the Elijah McClain case, if a civil case is brought against the police officers and EMTs, would they qualify for qualified immunity? Did Elijah McClain have constitutional rights to be free from detention and seizure? Did the police officers have probable cause to arrest Elijah McClain? Did the emergency medical technicians and paramedics have the authority to give Elijah McClain medication without his consent? And were the police officers, EMTs, and paramedics acting under the color of the law with good faith in this event? These are all great questions. Now, in the Elijah McClain case, Elijah McClain had the constitutional right to be free from detention and seizure. The Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. In this case, the police officers did not have probable cause to arrest Elijah McClain, as they did not have any evidence that he had committed a crime. In the Elijah McClain case, the emergency medical technicians and paramedics did not have the authority to continue to give Elijah McClain medication without his consent. Under the laws of the United States, EMTs and paramedics are not permitted to give medication to a patient without their informed consent. In this case, it is unclear whether the police officers, EMTs, and paramedics were acting under the color of the law and with good faith in this arrest. In order for a police officer, EMT, or paramedic to be protected by qualified immunity, they must have acted objectively and reasonably. In this case, it is unclear whether the police officers, EMTs, and paramedics acted in this objectively reasonable manner. Thank you.